The sun was going down, painting the sky with colors of red and gold. The ranch stood quiet on the edge of the desert, far away from towns, far away from voices. Only the sound of the wind moved through the dry grass and across the wooden fences. Inside the cabin, an old man sat by the fire. His face was marked with years of solitude, his hands rough from work that never seemed to end. He was a retired human soldier, now only a rancher, and he had lived alone for many years. No neighbors, no family, no one who knocked on his door. Silence had become his closest companion. He woke up with silence. He ate with silence. He went to bed with silence. The world outside had changed. Cities had grown taller. Technology had reached the stars. But here, at this lonely ranch, time seemed frozen. The only thing that moved forward were his memories, sometimes bright, sometimes dark. At night, when the wind grew colder, he often thought about the past, about the battles he had fought, the brothers he had lost, and the woman he once loved, but could never see again. His chest carried scars. No one could see scars heavier than the old rifle still hanging on the wall. One evening, as the fire burned low, the man stepped outside to feel the night air. The desert sky was wide and endless, full of stars. He often stared at them, thinking of the many worlds spinning out there. Some of those stars, he knew, were not just suns, they were homes. To others, aliens. Some were friendly. Some were not. He leaned against the porch railing, listening to the faint creak of old wood. But then, something new disturbed the silence. Footsteps. Soft, uncertain, and many. The man froze. His hand automatically reached for the pistol at his side. Nobody ever came here, not in all these years. His ranch was too far, too forgotten. The sound grew closer, shuffling feet in the dust. He narrowed his eyes at the horizon. 11 shadows moved slowly under the starlight. They were not men. Their shapes were different, their walk tired but graceful. As they came nearer, the details became clear. They were women, but not human. Women. Their skin glowed faintly under the moon, some with shades of silver, others with soft hues of blue and green. Their eyes were large, reflecting light like gems. They wore torn cloaks, their faces covered in dust, as if they had walked. For days, the old soldier's grip tightened on his pistol. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from disbelief. Aliens. On his land. They stopped just beyond the fence, their eyes fixed on him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the desert wind moved between them. Finally, one of them stepped forward. She was tall, with long dark hair that shimmered strangely under the starlight. Her voice was soft but heavy with exhaustion. We mean no harm," she said. Her accent twisted human words, but the meaning was clear. "We need your help." The man did not lower his pistol. His silence pressed against them like a wall. Another woman stepped forward, her hands trembling as she lifted her hood. Her face carried lines of grief, her eyes wet with tears. "We are widows," she whispered. "All of us." The soldier frowned. "Widows? Out here? Why come to him?" He thought it was a trick. Perhaps bandits using disguise. Perhaps scouts for raiders. But then he noticed the way their bodies shook, the way their lips cracked from thirst. These were not warriors. These were survivors. One by one, the women lowered their hoods. Each face carried pain, but also hope that maybe this old man, this lonely human, would not send them away. The leader took a step closer, her knees suddenly buckling. She dropped to the ground in front of him, her voice breaking. "We have nowhere else to go. They hunt us. Please, protect us." The old soldier's breath caught. The memory of battlefields returned, the helpless faces he could not save, the cries of those left behind. His heart told him to shut the door, to keep his silence safe. But his soul whispered something else. Still, his finger stayed near the trigger. "Who's hunting you?" he asked, his voice low. The leader raised her head slowly. Her eyes, glowing with fear, met his. "They will find us," she said. "If you turn us away, they will kill us before the next sunrise." The wind howled through the ranch, carrying her words into the night. The man's silence was broken, but his decision was not yet made. The shadows of the desert grew darker around them, and somewhere far away, the echo of engines hummed in. The distance. The ranch was no longer silent. The night had grown colder, but the air around the ranch burned with tension. The old soldier kept his pistol low but ready, his sharp eyes studying the 11 figures standing before him. They looked broken, fragile, yet there was something fierce hidden in their faces, a spark of survival. "Talk," he said finally, his voice rough from years of disuse. The leader, still kneeling on the dusty ground, lifted her head slowly. Her long dark hair fell across her glowing cheeks. "We are widows," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "Our mates, our families all gone, taken by war." The soldier narrowed his eyes. He had heard the word widow before, but never like this. War? Which war? Another woman, shorter, her skin pale blue under the moonlight, stepped forward. She pressed a hand to her chest. "Our world was torn apart," she said, her voice shaking. "The invaders came without warning. They slaughtered the men, the fathers, the sons. They left us with nothing but grief. We fled, and now—" Her voice broke into silence. The soldier looked at their clothes torn, stained, not the garments of warriors but of people running from something worse. He saw the scars across their arms, the way their eyes darted nervously toward the desert. Horizon, they weren't lying. Something was after them. The leader spoke again, her voice gaining strength. "They hunt us still, not for what we carry, but for what we are, widows of warriors. They fear we will rise. They fear we will remember how to fight." The man's jaw tightened. He knew fear. He knew hunters. He knew what it was like to be chased, to be outnumbered, to be cornered. Memories of his own battles flashed in his mind, ambushes, blood, the smell of burning fields, but he shoved those ghosts away. "Why come here?" he asked. "Why me?" The leader's eyes softened. "Because humans fight differently. Because your kind protects. We walked for many days. We followed whispers, old tales of soldiers who once fought not for conquest, but for others." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "We found you." The soldier shook his head slowly. "I'm no hero. I'm just a man on a forgotten ranch." "You are more than that," another widow said firmly. Her voice cut through the night like steel. She was younger, her eyes bright with defiance. "We saw the weapons buried in your shed. We saw the way you hold yourself. You are not just a farmer. You were a warrior once." The man's silence was answer enough. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. The women moved closer, though still careful, still afraid he might turn them away. The leader's voice cracked as she whispered the words that broke his heart. "We have no home. No shield, no man left to stand for us. If you send us away, we die before dawn." The soldier's chest tightened. He wanted to say no. He wanted to shut the gate, walk back into his cabin, and let the desert swallow their footsteps. But then, one of the widows collapsed against the fence, too weak to stand. Another knelt beside her, trying to lift her up, whispering words of comfort in a language he didn't know, but understood in his bones. For the first time in years, the ranch did not feel empty. It felt heavy with life, with pain, with desperate hope. He lowered his pistol, not completely but enough. "If I help you," he said slowly, "they'll come here. They'll bring fire to my land." The leader's eyes locked with his. "They will come whether you help us or not. You have already been seen. You are already marked. The choice is not whether danger arrives. It is whether you stand with us or stand alone." The silence of the ranch broke with those words. Far in the distance, the faint hum of engines echoed again, louder this time. The women all turned their heads, their faces pale with fear. The soldier followed their gaze, his hand tightening around. His pistol. He had heard that sound before. Not here, not on Earth. But on battlefields long ago. The hunters were close. The leader took a shaky breath. "Please," she begged, her voice no longer proud, no longer steady. "For one night give us your protection." The soldier felt the weight of 11 pairs of eyes pressing against him. For years he had lived alone, believing his war was over. Now the war was at his doorstep again. He said nothing. He only turned and pushed open the door of his cabin. The firelight spilled out into the dark. "Inside," he ordered. The widows moved quickly, helping one another, stepping into the warmth of his lonely home. For the first time in years, the cabin held voices, footsteps, and life. The soldier stood at the doorway, watching the desert. His eyes narrowed. If the hunters wanted them, they would have to go through him first. And he was not as weak as he looked. The cabin was no longer quiet. For the first time in years, its walls echoed with the sound of whispers, of careful footsteps, of alien voices that trembled with both fear and relief. The 11 widows huddled near the fire, their cloaks pulled tight, their eyes shifting to every creak of the wooden floor. But the man did not sit with them. He stood at the window, the old rifle resting against his shoulder. His eyes searched the horizon, scanning the desert that stretched wide and endless beneath the stars. He knew that sound, the low hum of engines carried by the wind. He knew it from war. And if his ears weren't lying, those engines were growing. Closer. The hunters were not far. He moved silently, pulling down the shutters, locking the cabin door. His hands were steady, but inside him, the soldier that had been buried for years began to stir again. The ranch was his peace, but now peace was gone. Behind him, one of the widows spoke. Her voice cracked. "They will find us, won't they?" He did not answer. Soldiers never promised what they could not give. Instead, he turned toward his old chest in the corner. The women watched as he dragged it forward, opened the heavy lid, and pulled out weapons wrapped in cloth. A pistol, a knife, a small box of charges. His past, sealed away, now returned. The widows stared in silence. They saw the truth. This man was not simply a lonely rancher. He was a warrior who had once carried death in his hands. The leader, the tall woman with dark hair, stepped closer. "Why hide out here if you still carry the weapons of your war?" He looked at her, his eyes cold but honest. "Because I was tired of killing." The room grew still, but outside the engines roared. Louder. The night air shivered as lights began to dance far off in the desert, red dots moving across the sand. The widows gasped. "They've tracked us," one whispered. Another clutched her cloak tighter. The man opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, his rifle in hand. The widows crowded at the windows, watching with wide, fearful eyes. The desert no longer seemed empty. Shadows moved across the horizon, growing bigger with every passing second. Then a voice broke through the night. It came from a machine, projected by a loudspeaker carried on one of the hunter ships. It was deep, metallic, and full of cruelty. "Human, we know you shelter them. Hand over the widows, and we may let you live." The widows shrank back in terror. Their bodies shook. Some of them covered their ears as if the voice itself cut into their bones. The man did not move. He stood tall on the porch, his rifle steady, his jaw tight. He had heard threats before, on battlefields where the ground was painted red. He knew what men like this did. He also knew what came next if he gave in. Behind him, the leader's voice broke the silence. "They will kill us if you hand us over. You know that." He turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers through the cabin's doorway. "I know." Another blast from the loudspeaker shook the air. "Last chance, human. Refuse us, and we burn your home. We burn your land. We burn you alive." The desert wind carried the echo of those words across the ranch. The widows looked at the man, their faces pale with dread. But the soldier, he did not step back. He took a long, steady breath, and then he spoke not to the hunters, but to himself. I fought for peace once, and peace never lasted. Maybe it's time I fought for something else. He raised his rifle toward the horizon, the cold metal gleaming under the moonlight. The widows held their breath. The hunters began to close in, and the ranch, once silent, braced itself for war. The red lights of the hunter ships moved slowly across the horizon, circling like wolves. The night air buzzed with their engines, but for the moment, they kept their distance. They were waiting, watching, testing the old human's will. Inside the cabin, fear pressed heavy against the walls. The 11 widows sat close to the fire, their eyes darting at every sound outside. Some whispered in their own tongue, prayers or fragments of songs from a home now lost. Others stayed silent, staring at the man who stood near the door, his rifle never leaving his grip. But then, without a word, he moved to the corner of the cabin. He pulled back an old rug and opened a hidden hatch in the floor. Dust rose as the heavy cover creaked open, revealing stairs that led into darkness. The widows leaned forward, curiosity breaking through their fear. "What is that?" one asked softly. The soldier lit an old lantern and descended the steps. "Follow," he said. His voice was calm, but there was iron beneath it. One by one, the widows followed him down. What they found beneath the cabin made their eyes widen in shock. The hidden cellar was no ordinary storage space. It was a bunker, walls lined with steel, shelves stacked with supplies, and weapons resting in careful rows. Old crates stamped with military symbols sat untouched for years, but still strong. The widows whispered among themselves. They had seen soldiers before, they had seen armies, but never had they seen a single man keep such power hidden under a quiet ranch. "You lived alone," one of them said slowly, "but you were always ready for war." The man placed the lantern on a table and began checking each weapon with steady hands. "I was never ready," he said. "But war has a way of finding men like me." The leader stepped closer, her eyes fixed on him. "You could have walked away when you saw us. You could have closed your door." His hands paused for a moment. He looked at her, his face half hidden in shadow. "I tried to close the door on the world once. But the world doesn't care what we want. It comes for us anyway." Silence filled the bunker. Then, without asking, the soldier pushed one of the crates open. He pulled out a smaller weapon, lighter, easier to hold, and placed it in the hands of the youngest widow. She froze, staring down at it. I don't know how to fight." "You'll learn," he said simply. The widows exchanged uneasy glances. Some clutched the weapons with shaking hands. Others looked away, ashamed of their fear. But one widow, her skin silver like moonlight, held hers firmly. "If they take us alive," she said quietly, "our suffering will be worse than death. I'd rather fight." The man nodded once. That was enough for him. Hours slipped by in the bunker. He showed them how to hold a weapon, how to aim, how to move quietly. His voice was low, calm, but there was something dangerous in the way he carried himself, like a wolf teaching cubs to bare their teeth. The widows listened. They watched. They tried. Their hands trembled, but slowly, strength began to replace weakness. By the time they returned upstairs, the ranch no longer felt like a place of hiding. It felt like a fortress waiting to be tested. The leader stood near the door, staring out into the desert. The hunter ships had moved closer, their lights glowing brighter now, their shadows crawling across the sand. She whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "We were not meant to fight again, but maybe this is where we rise." The soldier stepped up beside her, his eyes fixed on the enemy. "They think you're prey. Let's remind them what happens when prey decides to bite back." The fire inside the cabin crackled. The widows, once trembling with fear, now sat straighter, their eyes sharper. Something had shifted. The man had given them more than weapons. He had given them a reason to believe they could survive. Outside. The hunters circled, waiting for dawn. Inside. The ranch was no longer silent, no longer weak. It was ready. Asterisk. Midnight fell heavy on the desert. The stars burned cold above, and the wind carried only silence. The widows sat inside the cabin, their weapons close, their hearts racing. Every creak of the wooden boards, every shift of the firelight made them tense. The old soldier sat by the door, rifle in his lap. His eyes never closed. He had been waiting. He knew hunters. He knew they never kept their threats empty. And then it began. A sharp whistle cut through the night air, unnatural, high-pitched, echoing like a scream. The widow stiffened. One covered her ears. Another whispered, "They're here." The ground shook as something heavy landed just outside the ranch fence. A second thud followed, then a third. Lights swept across the fields, red beams crawling like claws across the sand. The soldier stood slowly, his body calm, his breath steady. He lifted his rifle. "Stay low," he told the widows. His voice was quiet, but it carried command. "And do not panic. Panic gets you killed." The cabin windows flashed bright as an explosion ripped through the fence outside, splinters of wood flying into the night. The hunters had begun their raid. Figures moved in the shadows, tall, armored shapes with glowing visors. Their weapons crackled with alien fire, spitting blue sparks into the dark. The widows gasped, fear pulling them to the ground. But the soldier didn't flinch. He raised his rifle, aimed with the precision of years past, and fired. One hunter dropped instantly, his body crashing against the sand. The widows stared in shock. They had expected chaos, maybe even failure. But the old man fought like death itself stood in his hands. The hunters roared, firing back. Bolts of energy tore through the cabin walls, leaving smoking holes. The widows screamed, ducking under the tables. One widow cried out as a beam grazed her arm. "Keep your heads down." The soldier barked. He moved like a shadow sliding from window to window, firing, reloading, firing again. Every shot counted. Every movement was sharp and efficient, but the hunters were many. More shadows poured in from the desert. Their boots thundered against the dirt as they closed in on the cabin. The soldier's eyes narrowed. They wanted to surround him, cut him off. Burn him out, not tonight. He grabbed one of the crates, pulled free a small charge, and slammed it against the wall. With a grunt, he tossed it out the window. Seconds later, the night split open with fire. 2 hunters were thrown back in flames, their screams cut short. Inside the cabin, the widows clung to one another. But among the fear, something else stirred courage. One of them, her silver skin glowing in the firelight, crawled to the soldier's side. Her hands shook as she raised the pistol he had given her earlier. "I want to fight," she whispered. He looked at her. For a brief second, the ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then fight." The first shot she fired missed, but the second struck true, clipping a hunter's shoulder. The armored figure stumbled, and the soldier finished him with a clean shot. More widows joined in, clumsy at first, terrified still, but their fear turned into fire. The cabin was no longer just a place to hide. It was a battlefield. The hunters, frustrated, pulled back for a moment. And then one of them shouted in a guttural voice, words twisted by a translator, "Burn them out!" The soldier's heart tightened. He knew what that meant. Fire. Outside, one of the hunter ships lowered, its engines howling. A hatch opened, and a weapon the size of a cannon dropped down, glowing with deadly energy. The widows panicked, voices rising in terror. "They'll destroy everything." The soldier grabbed his rifle tighter. His eyes locked on the ship. He didn't hesitate. "Not if I get them first." He sprinted out the door before anyone could stop him, the desert wind whipping across his face. Gunfire exploded around him, beams of light tearing through the sand. But he didn't slow. His boots pounded the ground until he slid into cover behind a half-broken fence post. The widows screamed from the cabin. Watching helplessly, he raised his rifle. 1 shot, 2 shots. The cannon glowed brighter, seconds from firing, and then a widow's scream pierced the air behind him. He spun just in time to see one of the widows, the youngest, dragged into the shadows by a hunter. Her weapon fell, her voice lost in the chaos. The soldier's blood ran cold. For years he had lived alone, untouched by war, untouched by loss. But tonight, the war was back. Tonight, his choice was clear. He had to save her, even if it meant facing the hunters head-on. The night was alive with fire and smoke. The hunter ship lifted slowly, its engines blasting dust across the ranch. Inside, the youngest widow struggled, her hands bound, her cries muffled. She kicked and clawed, but the armored hunter dragged her deeper into the ship's hold. From the ground, the old soldier's eyes burned with fury. His rifle still smoked from the last kill, but his focus was locked on her fading silhouette. He had seen too many innocents dragged away in war. He would not let it happen again. "Get the truck," he shouted. The widows hesitated, stunned by his sudden command. But the leader snapped out of her shock and pointed to the rusted desert hauler parked beside the barn. "Move, do what he says." The widows ran, pushing their weak bodies into action. The old engine coughed as it came alive, belching smoke, but it roared with desperate strength. The soldier jumped into the driver's seat, his hands steady on the cracked wheel. "Hold on," he growled. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning. In the sand, the widows clung to the rails, their cloaks whipping in the desert wind. Ahead of them, the hunter ship rose, its lights blazing across the dunes. The chase had begun. The truck bounced violently as it tore across the desert. Sand sprayed high into the night air. The widows' eyes watered, their hearts racing, but none dared to look back. Every gaze was fixed on the ship that carried their sister away. The soldier's jaw tightened. He shifted gears with a grunt, forcing the machine harder. The desert seemed endless, the dunes rising and falling like waves, but he had driven through worse. He knew how to hunt in silence, and tonight he was the predator. The hunters noticed. The ship banked low, engines screaming, and from its open hatch poured firebolts of blue energy smashing into the sand around the truck. Explosions lit the night, throwing shadows across their terrified faces. The widows screamed, ducking low. One of them, the silver-skinned widow who had fired earlier, raised her weapon and returned fire, sparks flying into the darkness. Her aim was shaky, but her courage was sharp. "Keep firing." The soldier barked. Another widow joined her, then another. Shots cracked from the truck bed, alien voices shouting against the roar of engines. They were no longer just refugees. They were fighters now. The ship pulled higher, out of reach. The soldier narrowed his eyes. He needed a plan. He slammed his foot on the brake. The truck skidded sideways, sand spraying high. The widows cried out in panic, holding onto each other. But the soldier was calm. He jumped from the cab, grabbing a launcher from the crate in the back. "What are you doing?" The leader shouted, "Ending this." He knelt in the sand, the launcher heavy on his shoulder. He breathed slow, steady, waiting. The ship circled, engines whining, preparing another pass. The widows held their breath. The soldiers squeezed the trigger. The sky exploded. The rocket streaked upward, a blazing line of fire. It slammed into the ship's wing, tearing metal apart. The hunters inside roared in panic as the vessel tilted. Smoke and sparks trailing behind, the widows cheered, their voices breaking into desperate relief. But the fight wasn't over. The ship didn't crash. It staggered, burning, and pushed onward. Its engine screamed as it sped toward the canyon that cut deep into the desert. The soldier cursed under his breath. He knew what they were doing, using the canyon to hide, to lose him in the maze of stone. He threw the launcher back into the truck. Get in. They won't get away. The widows scrambled, and the truck roared forward once more. Dust swallowed them as they chased the burning ship into the canyon. The walls of rock rose high on either side, turning the world into a narrow throat of stone. The sound of engines thundered between the cliffs, echoing like drums of war. Soldier gripped the wheel, his eyes sharp. They think they know this desert, but it's my ground now. The widows looked at him, their fear tempered by awe. This man, this human, was no longer just a stranger. He was their shield, their hunter, their chance to survive. Up ahead, sparks rained from the hunter ship as it struggled to stay airborne. The kidnapped widow's scream echoed faintly into the night. The soldier pressed the accelerator to the floor. Hold on tight, we're not letting her go. The truck surged forward, deeper into the canyon, chasing fire and shadows. And in the darkness ahead, the final confrontation waited. The canyon walls rose like giants on both sides, their jagged edges glowing faintly from the fire trailing off the wounded hunter ship. The old truck bounced and roared through the narrow path, chasing the ship deeper and deeper. Every turn sent echoes crashing back, the sound of engines and gunfire mixing with the cries of the widows. The youngest widow's scream still carried through the night, faint but sharp enough to pierce the soldier's chest. He had heard many screams in his life, but this one he would not ignore. The truck burst into a wide clearing inside the canyon. The ship had landed roughly, smoke hissing from its side. Hunters poured out, tall armored figures, weapons glowing, forming a circle of steel around their prize. The widow was dragged to the center, her wrists bound, her eyes wide with terror. The soldier slammed the truck to a stop. Dust clouded the air as he stepped out, rifle in hand. The widows followed, their cloaks whipping in the canyon wind, weapons trembling but raised. The leader looked at him, her eyes steady despite the fear. This is where we make our stand. He nodded once. No running, not anymore. The hunters advanced. Their leader, taller than the rest, stepped forward, his voice booming through the canyon. Human, you should have walked away. This is not your fight. The soldier's voice was low, but it carried like thunder. Everything becomes my fight when you come to my land. The hunters roared and charged. The canyon erupted. Bolts of blue fire streaked across the stone walls, lighting the night in violent flashes. The widows fired back, their shots wild but desperate, their fear burned into fury. The soldier moved with deadly precision. Each shot he took dropped a hunter. Each step he took controlled the battlefield. The widows fought alongside him, their voices rising with defiance. No longer just widows of fallen men, they were warriors. Reborn. But the hunters were many. The circle closed tighter. The kidnapped widow cried out as one hunter raised his blade above her. The soldier's heart slammed. He sprinted forward, faster than his age should have allowed. His rifle roared, the blade fell, and the widow stumbled free into his arms. "You're safe now," he said, pulling her behind him. His eyes burned with fire. Nobody takes what's mine to protect. The battle grew savage. Hunters clashed, hand to hand with the soldier, their armored fists hammering against him. But the old warrior fought like a storm. His knife flashed, his rifle cracked, and his strength carried him where others would have fallen. The widows screamed and fought harder, covering him, their courage unbreakable now. The canyon floor was littered with sparks, blood, and broken armor. Finally, only the hunter leader remained. His massive frame towered over the others, his weapon glowing like molten fire. He faced the soldier with a roar that shook the stones. Soldier stood firm, blood on his face, rifle in his hands. The widows gathered behind him, their weapons aimed, their voices silent, but their presence strong. "This ends now. The soldier growled. The hunter charged. The canyon trembled with his steps. The soldier fired once, twice, 3 times. The shots tore through armor, but did not stop him. The hunter raised his weapon high, ready to strike, and then 11 shots cracked at once. The widows fired together, their courage forged into steel. The blasts ripped through the leader's chest, dropping him to his knees. He fell hard, the canyon echoing with his final roar before silence swallowed everything. The battle was over. Smoke drifted through the canyon. The widows stood trembling, their weapons lowering, their breaths heavy. For the first time in years, their eyes were not only full of grief. They carried something else, hope. That the soldier wiped blood from his brow and looked at them. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a vow. You're safe now. As long as you stand here, no one will ever take you again. The widows looked at him, their protector, their warrior. And in that broken canyon, under the cold light of alien stars, they knew this man who had once lived in silence was no longer alone. The ranch would never be silent again.